Thank you for being here. I would love to get a sense, and I think it would be encouraging for all of us to see who's in the room. If you're a high school student or a teacher who brought high school students here, could you stand, please? High school students and any teachers. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us. If you're a UConn student or a student from another university, could you please stand? I know we have some students here from Bard. Thank you very much. If you're a community member who really has no connection to UConn professionally, could you please stand? You've just come here because you're interested. Ordinary people, thank you. I know I said this earlier when we opened the day, but it's so incredibly encouraging when so many people have spent so much time planning this event to just see the room full session after session after session. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the concern you show for this topic and the concern you show for making this world a better place and taking your role as a defender of democracy and human rights. Our afternoon panel, the first of our afternoon panels today, is going to pick up where the last of our morning panels left off, which were questions of what are the crimes being committed in Ukraine and what are accountability for those crimes. I think anytime we focus on a case study, like we're doing with Ukraine for most of this day, it's important to realize that we're learning a lot about Ukraine, for sure, but we're also learning a lot from Ukraine. There are lessons to be learned from Ukraine that are important for a wide range of other case studies. So in this particular panel, what we want to focus on is the naming of the crimes, because what we're holding on to is a belief, and this is what we have to hold on to, is that one day the people responsible for the crimes being committed in Ukraine will be held accountable for that. We can't give up on that belief. The truth is that many times, too many times, perpetrators of atrocities do get away with it. They're not held accountable, but we don't have a reason to act in that way. We can go forward in the belief that these crimes are going to be held. The people perpetrating these crimes are going to be held accountable, and it's important now for us to begin thinking about what those crimes are. War crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of genocide, crime of aggression. And once we understand what those crimes are, what types of things do we do to ensure that the people who've committed these crimes will be held accountable? Because that important piece of documentation, particularly, is not something we start after the fact. It's something we start during the fact of the crime. We were scheduled today to have 4 panelists join us. One of the panelists is unable to join us, Mr. Konstantin Usov. Konstantin's deputy mayor of Kyiv, Ukraine. Konstantin was not able to receive permission to travel to come here because of the current crisis in Ukraine and because of some of his political responsibilities in Kyiv. But just a brief background about Konstantin, because he was very insistent that he still deliver a pre-recorded message for us, because he was devastated he couldn't be here with us. And we got that pre-recorded message about 40 minutes ago, so we're going to play it. It's going to happen. But Konstantin, as I said, is the deputy mayor of Kyiv, Ukraine. He was elected a member of the Kyiv City Council in 2020, and in February 2021, Kyiv's mayor, who you likely have seen on the television, Vitaly Klitschko, appointed Usov deputy mayor of Kyiv. When Russia attacked Ukraine in February 2022, Konstantin was responsible for the transportation and evacuation of civilians in Kyiv's vicinity. He received his bachelor's degree in journalism from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv and his master's in public administration from Harvard University. Again, he's not able to be with us here today. He was devastated at that fact, but we do have the privilege of having a pre-recorded message from him. After we hear the message, I'll introduce our other 3 panelists who are here with us, and we'll start the panel. So Alex, please.
All the microphones. national background is in law, I'd like to offer a more emotional perspective in this panel today. The date of February 24th of 2022 may now seem distant, but as the deputy mayor of Kyiv responsible for transportation, I vividly recall that morning when Russian invasion struck Ukraine from all directions, including the north, marching from Belarus and cutting through the uninhabited exclusion zone around Chernobyl, quickly reaching the outskirts of Kyiv. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko summoned his team around 5:40 a.m. to issue initial orders and urge all of us to be decisive. It was a moment when formal ranks became insignificant. Anyone willing to lead with courage, take action, and shoulder responsibility gained whatever authority was necessary. As we witness hundreds of thousands of people creating a tsunami of an exodus towards Poland along a single highway in Kyiv, we devised a way to counter the Russian cyber attack and adjust traffic control to facilitate a westward greenway for every vehicle. We were making decisions at an impossible speed. It took us half an hour to deactivate every turnstile at every station and make all municipal transport in Kyiv operate free of charge for everyone. By the middle of the first day, our fleet of municipal buses and trucks was engaged in transporting soldiers, equipment, weaponry, and God knows what else. Later in March of 2022, I was tasked with organizing the evacuation of civilians from the occupied suburbs of Kyiv, including towns like Irpin, Bordenka, and Bucha, now infamous for the atrocities, medieval brutality, and war crimes committed by the Russian army. I remember standing in an airfield-sized parking lot, hastily prepared to welcome and screen evacuees. And among them, we found Russian saboteurs, foreign citizens, astonished by their survival, numerous wounded Ukrainian men, children, and many silent Ukrainian women. A friend of mine from CNN made footage about his discovery of a basement in Bucha filled with the bodies of civilians, their hands found behind their backs, and fatal gunshot wounds to their foreheads. He then asked me why he and his peers from other media outlets struggled to find witnesses or victims of the rape that everyone was talking about. Concerning this specific type of war crime, the Ukrainian law enforcement system was initially reluctant to facilitate media coverage, both foreign and domestic. However, it is now acceptable to reveal that the victims of sexual violence whom my CNN counterpart spoke to were located in one of the many Ukrainian hospitals that, at the time, had entire floors dedicated to accommodating, treating, and safeguarding women who had suffered such abuse at the hands of Russians. Among the numerous stories I heard from our municipal doctors, two stood out as illustrations of Russian motives behind this large-scale horror. In the first account, a Russian infantry member told his victim that their actions were related to what they perceived as a duty for Ukrainian women to, quote-unquote, start producing Russian children from now on. The second story revolved around a Ukrainian woman singing lullabies to quiet her baby while Russian soldiers ransacked her home wine bar after already killing her husband. The crying baby was annoying drunken Russian soldiers, and the mother sang this ancient Ukrainian lullaby to soothe her child to sleep. She then was commanded to recall some Russian bedtime song, and when it became evident that she didn't know any, a violent act by the Russian started, and her baby was there. Every war is dreadful and can serve as a breeding ground for atrocities and ugly subhuman behavior. However, 21st century wars offer humanity an unprecedented amount of data, transparency, and evidence for bringing occupying forces and war criminals to justice. Regarding the Kremlin and Russia in general, justice must be sought through the imperfect yet crucial international legal avenues, the International Criminal Court, and potentially other tribunal initiatives, sanctions, isolation, and of course Ukraine's military strength, supported by united and steadfast allies who share our values of freedom and dignity. However, in a broader context, I view international justice as the art of restoring the world's inner harmony amidst discord. Justice should be seen as a gentle collective hand working towards collective healing, reconciliation, and a commitment to a shared future that upholds the right and dignity of all. Justice should be able not only to punish the criminal, but it should also have the capacity to transform the scars of conflict into bridges of understanding and pave the way for peaceful and productive coexistence for years to come. Once justice is framed in this manner, it becomes evident that military defeat and holding Russia accountable are necessary prerequisites for a bigger job, which is to change the way Russian people see the world and themselves in it. The deep-rooted issue of national identity is what has prevented Russian society from acknowledging its actions towards Ukraine and other neighbors for over the last 300 years. This distorted concept of what makes a nation great inhibits Russia from becoming a reliable member of the international community. I know many Russians. Russians are proud people, but they have never known how to be proud of themselves because of the music of Tchaikovsky, novels of Tolstoy, or pictures by Bruegel. After centuries of territorial expansion and invading neighboring nations, Russians have found pride and greatness in dominating others. Russians will never be able to make peace with the world until they are compelled to abandon the oppressive aspect of their identity and make peace with themselves, acknowledging the impossibility of continuing, let alone triumphing in new barbaric territorial quests, along with the high price they must pay for such attempts, will help Russians realize that they can be a content and proud nation without being a bully, constantly defeated, held accountable, and burdened with decades of costly reparations. This is the justice I believe in. Again, I thank you for your attention and wish other panelists a productive discussion with the audience today. I wish I could be with you.
Thank you. We're sorry for the small technical glitches, but Konstantin was so wonderful to take the time and provide us with that. We wanted to make sure that you had a chance to see and hear his remarks. I've been working in the field of genocide studies, Holocaust genocide studies now for over 30 years. One of the things you get from working in that field is a deep appreciation for people who take care with definitions of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of aggression, ethnic cleansing. When you work in the field, you understand the importance of those terms, and you understand the importance of defining them in ways so they can't be easily weaponized by people who want to use the term to just bludgeon someone else or some other cause. So we thought it very important today that we think deeply with you about what these words mean, what these crimes are that are being committed, and how we hold the perpetrators accountable. It's especially a pleasure to introduce a panel where you can say about each of the panelists, you consider them good friends, people you respect, people you look up to, people you enjoy being with, and I have the great pleasure of introducing these three panelists today. The first is Dr. Kristina Hook. Kristina is an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University School of Conflict Management in Georgia. She's an anthropologist and scholar practitioner specializing in civilian protection and the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. She's a former Fulbright scholar to Ukraine. She's conducted extensive field work there since 2015 and is writing a book on the Ukrainian Holodomor. Hook received her joint PhD in Anthropology and Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame. She previously served as a U.S. Department of State Policy Advisor for Mass Atrocities Prevention, as a non-resident research fellow at the Marine Corps University, and as a U.S. Presidential Management Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristina Hook to the platform. The remaining two panelists, if you were here earlier this morning, you've already been introduced to, but sometimes a panelist is so brilliant that their brilliance can't be confined to one panel. It has to be spread out across two, and that is the case with both of these. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrea Peto, who is a historian and professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria. If you were here earlier, you heard from Andrea that she is a professor at a university in exile, Central European University, having been forced out of Hungary with the democratic collapse there. Her work on gender, politics, Holocaust, and war has been translated into 23 languages, and I don't think there's any of us who work and teach in the field that don't reference some aspect of Andrea's work. She was awarded the 2018 All-European Academy's Madame de Stael Prize for Cultural Values and the 2022 University of Oslo Human Rights Award. She's a doctorate honoris causa at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. Please join me in welcoming Andrea to the platform. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Anna Vyshniakova, an expert analyst and consultant in the fields of international criminal and international humanitarian law. Anna and I have had the pleasure of working together on virtual training for Ukrainian prosecutors over the past year and a half. She assists law enforcement agencies to establish accountability for the extensive array of war crimes that have taken place in Ukraine, not just since 2022, but since 2014. She's provided her expertise as a consultant for many Ukrainian and international organizations, and in March 2023, she founded her own NGO, LingvaLexa, with a specific focus on combating atrocity speech crimes. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Vyshniakova back to the stage. Our format will be similar to what we did this morning. I have a prompt that I've provided to each of the panelists. Each of them will make 10 minutes of opening remarks in response to the prompt. We'll have a follow-up discussion, and then we'll be able to turn over the final half hour of the time to questions and interaction with you. I've been very appreciative of the way in which you've engaged in civil and respectful discourse with each other and with the panelists, so we'll look forward to continuing that as well. The prompt that I've asked each panelist to respond to is this: what atrocity crimes do you believe we have evidence of Russia committing in its most recent invasion of Ukraine? And do we have the structures in place to ensure accountability for these crimes? We'll first start with Dr. Kristina Hook. Kristina?
Thank you very much, Jim. It is just a tremendous honor for me to be here with my fellow panelists and with you. And I would also like to say that for me as an American researcher, it is a tremendous privilege for me to speak about things that are happening to the people of Ukraine. And on that note, I think it is just really helpful before, we've said we're going to get a little bit dry and boring, but just to acknowledge the privilege of having this conversation in safety, that we won't have an air raid interrupt our time right now. And I just wanted to share something a little personal to me. As I have been living and working in Ukraine since 2015, I noticed a colleague there mentioning that there are now toddlers in Ukraine that don't really know life outside of the bomb shelter routine, and that made me very sad. And I also can say that I have been in places in eastern Ukraine before 2022 where I heard similar things, where I heard a 5-year-old one time say, wow, did you know that people used to just be able to go outside during the day anytime they wanted? And so I think that that's just a sort of important place to situate our conversation. And now on to the dry and boring part, but no less important, because these are not just definitions, and these aren't just things that I would quiz students on or debate with my legal colleagues, but these are legal tools that help us to make decisions to protect people. Our planet's really most precious resource, right, is people. And so really in just thinking about the category of atrocity crimes, I think this says this, but I'm speaking first, so I'll take the liberty. When we talk about atrocity crimes in this context for this conversation, I'm going to be talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I think that it's just important to talk sometimes a little bit about the differences between those. For example, war crimes take place in the context of armed conflict. Crimes against humanity can take place in armed conflict, but also can take place in peacetime. Or to talk about things like the crime against humanity definition has some broad language in it, which talking about grave, systematic targeting of civilians, but it has a sort of language in it, other humane acts, and that's a little bit broader than what we might see in the genocide definition. And also the genocide definition has this language about intent. And so that was coming out in our morning panel, and it's going to come out in my remarks as well. But I want to just collectively talk about atrocity crimes because they can happen concurrently, even though they can take place against different groups of people. And I actually wanted to quote something that is from the 2014 United Nations Framework for the Analysis of Atrocity Crimes, which is language that, to me, makes it so important that we talk about victims of all of these crimes. And so they talk about atrocity crimes as the most serious crime against humankind, I think inviting us to consider these acts not just against the direct victim, but against all of us. And they talk about this category collectively as violating the core dignity of human beings, in particular, the persons that should be most protected by the state. So thinking about this idea of civilians. And so I will focus my remarks on this question of genocide. Why not jump into the deep end, as it were? And I can also mention that I am the principal author of one of the independent legal inquiries into this question. And so I'm really indebted to my legal colleagues and my other colleagues for some of the remarks I'll make. Nobody does this type of work alone. And you can find it, I brought it with me. It's the Russian Federation's Escalating Commission of Genocide in Ukraine, a legal analysis. And so I want to acknowledge the contributions of my colleagues for some of my remarks as well. And so what I'd really like to talk about when talking about genocide is the fact that we focus a lot, including in my own research, on the commission of genocide, the act of genocide. But it is important to know in the UN definition that that alone is not the only type of thing that is prohibited, that also there are lots of other things. And I'm going to save some of my remarks on this for my colleague because I'm sitting next to an expert in this. But there's also this category of direct and public incitement to genocide, and that means a couple different precise things. So the type of work that I've been doing with the New Lines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights has issued a first report on this in May 2022, and in this first report, the report concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the Russian Federation was in breach of the Genocide Convention in that area, and notifying all state signatories to be put on notice regarding their obligation to not just punish genocide, but to prevent it. It's the UN Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide. And so later, in July 2023, we issued a follow-up report. We looked at what had happened, what had changed, and we came to the conclusion that both the direct and public incitement had escalated. I will just refer you to online because it's about 60 pages, and so serious claims like I'm making require serious evidence, and so I hope all of you will fact-check me in the report. A shout out to our research assistants because we give them hundreds of citations to format for us. We really want our colleagues colleagues and you in the audience to be able to track along with some of the evidence I'm suggesting. You can find it online. But we found that escalated, and we also looked specifically at the commission of genocide, which again is very contested, very hard to prove, because it is not just a list of 5 prohibited acts, but it's acts with the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And so it has to do with this motive. And so I think, I really would refer you to the report for some of to fact check me on it, to look at the evidence of these claims that I'm making to you. And I think I'll just zoom out my remarks and talk a little bit more broadly. And so I wanted to just point out, for me, as someone who's been working in the field for a while, some things that stood out for me. And one of them was, we looked at sort of all 5 prohibited acts. So sort of colloquially, maybe like spokes of the genocide wheel. There's 5 prohibited acts. It's killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm. It's about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life that are calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. And then it also has to do with intending measures to prevent births, as well as the forcible transfer of children to another group. And again, not just that those things are happening, but they're happening with specific intent. And so when we looked at, okay, we see them happening, what about intent? We do make this argument that there are reasonable grounds to believe that this is happening due to a pattern of atrocities from which you can infer this intent. And so for me, it was extremely sobering. You don't want, in my field, to kind of diagnose this. It's a very challenging type of crime. I do a lot with perpetrator logics. And so you can imagine that a perpetrator who's not just out there to repress people, to harm them, to do terrible things that they should also have accountability for, but not even just those things, but intent to destroy, that takes a certain type of mindset that's really hard to dissuade. That takes a certain type of state organization that's really challenging to dismantle. That takes a lot of people. You know, we used to say in sort of policy circles, a whole of government approach to preventing atrocities, but I'd argue that there's a sort of whole of government approach to perpetrating atrocities as well in this case. There's a lot of different legislative and executive bodies that are working in some way on this. And as I wrap up my remarks, I will just make a quick note, if you'll indulge me, Jim, on accountability. I'm taking a lot of time, but I wanted to just say that 2 things. First of all, I don't want to undercut at all the importance of prosecution. So I want to point out that there have been 153 different states who have ratified or acceded the UN Genocide Convention according to the UN's website. And I'd like you to invite you to consider with me any issue in the world that you think 153 countries would not just agree on or have a resolution on, but would also legally obligate themselves through their own domestic processes. So the Genocide Convention is very, very powerful, kind of that foundation of human rights law in many ways from its origin. And that's something really important, I would say almost priceless, because it's hard for me to imagine us being able as a global community to legally obligate ourselves, 153 and growing, we hope, to something. And so the problem of not prosecuting it when you've got prohibited acts, when you can, I would argue, infer that intent to destroy, and when you have from low-level perpetrators to head of state Vladimir Putin. When we rolled out our report, my colleague, the first U.S. ambassador for war crimes, David Sheffer, said that to him, Vladimir Putin is sort of walking self-incriminator. And so I'd like to point out that, we talk a lot in Ukraine about what we're either bolstering and buttressing in the sort of terms of the international system, or what we're undermining. And I would argue that a sort of political will failure to prosecute this would undermine that system. And then again, like as always, I say every time they give me a microphone, I like to say that the central duty of the Genocide Convention is prevention. So I'll wrap up my remarks for that. But of course, the call is not just about one day seeing these perpetrators in the courtroom, but I would just like to issue a call to prevent what is happening to Ukrainians now.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristina, for your remarks. Appreciate it. Anna, we can turn next to you, please.
Kristina, thank you so much for making this introduction about the crimes, and thank you very much for the report. I would highly recommend to read this report because like lots of prosecutors and other people from the law enforcement agencies are just like praising it. So thank you very much for an absolutely amazing job on the report. So basically, if Kristina already made that introduction on the crimes, I can tell you some probably things about how the law enforcement system in Ukraine is working and is coping with such a huge amount of crimes. So I was observing an amazing evolution of the law enforcement system since I started to work with the prosecutors, I guess, in 2020. And our cooperation started from the trainings. And I remember very well, can you raise the hands who are lawyers here to understand? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll try not to be very legal. But you have heard about Geneva Conventions, right? Great, and they have the additional protocols. And I remember how during my first training, so imagine like I just graduated from the university, from like having second LLM, and coming to the prosecutors who know everything, of course, you can imagine Eastern European prosecutors, and starting to tell them the things about war crimes. And I remember very well, they asked me like, Anna, why do we need to use that Geneva Conventions? We are not in Switzerland. And I'm like, great, now I understand this kind of level. And of course, it was initially quite challenging because you had to work with the system that basically was making some very interesting mistakes, because initially we didn't make the qualification on the war crimes. We're calling it terrorism because of some political agenda that is quite interesting. So that was the very start, and now I see definitely amazing professionals who are doing a fantastic job, an absolutely fantastic job. I'm saying that the prosecutors and police with whom I'm working, they are absolute superheroes. So how the system works? We're having, in 2019, there appeared a special war crimes department within the Office of the Prosecutor General. And then there were the reflective, I guess it's in English, departments within Lugansk Oblast and Donetsk Oblast, so that are basically working just on war crimes. And of course, with the full-scale invasion, the quantity of this war crimes department, it became higher. So now imagine, what are the main difficulties? Ukrainian prosecutors now worked with the international crimes. You just heard like all the difficulties about, definitely not all part of the difficulties about proving genocide. To prove war crimes, it's very, very difficult. And about crimes against humanity, I'm not talking because we do not have crimes against humanity in Criminal Code of Ukraine. That is quite weird. Prosecutors and police who are working on ordinary crimes like murders, stealing something, rapes, starting to work on genocide. This is absolutely different type of crime. And of course, it was very challenging to make that switch from seeing everything through the domestic agenda and that misunderstanding on how to work with absolutely different patterns, absolutely different scales, and different, let's say, case system. The second big challenge, so basically the first challenge is to understand how to switch from working with domestic crimes to work with the international crimes. And law enforcement system in Ukraine is doing a fantastic job in it. The second thing is, of course, the capacity building and the management of crimes. So just imagine, at one day, on the 24th of February, the full-scale invasion starts, and despite that everyone was talking about this, as it was previously told that Ukrainian law enforcement system was definitely not the strongest system in the world, such a huge amount of crimes is just common. So how to manage it? How to prioritize it? How to build the strategy? And the crimes are common and common and common, and now we are having that huge amount of crimes, and definitely to build a right case management system with the usage of artificial intelligence, with the usage of practical, correct databases. Basically, in all the armed conflicts, all the lawyers and all the law enforcement agencies are dreaming about a proper database. So you're collecting the evidence. We're talking about the documentation of evidence, how to store them, how to systematize them. Just imagine, these are hundreds of thousands of files. I remember the very first and second day, when we were monitoring the internet and trying to gather those photos, we didn't know where to put them, which Excel table to do, and on which Google disk to store them for it to be secure. So of course, this is also a very big challenge. one of the very interesting questions to be raised is, of course, how objective the law enforcement system in Ukraine can be. There was one interesting research how the rugby matches, or rugby match, right? Rugby games, influence the judge decisions. So, like, if the rugby team that the judge is supporting is losing, which judgments he will be making, which verdicts he will be making the next day. So just imagine how to work for the law enforcement agencies to be objective while bombardments, while staying on the occupied territories, being tortured. Because when Russian soldiers were coming into Ukraine, they had the lists with the names, and in that lists there were the names of the prosecutors, police, military people, and immediately they were taking lots of policemen to that basements and tortured them. And with the prosecutors, it's also more or less the same story. So just imagine how difficult it's to be objective, and still the law enforcement system in Ukraine is doing quite a good job on it. So just to wrap up, I would say that also we're having definitely problems with the legislation, because Ukrainian legislation is not adopted to the prosecution of war crimes and other international crimes. But on the other hand, we're having the huge amount of definitely amazing patriotic people who are just want to do the best for their country. And just like final remark, with many prosecutors and police, we just became friends, because when you're just sitting and working on these cases, it's like you're just becoming very close, and it's always about human beings. And the stories that they were telling, you know, like how they found themselves on just the occupied territories with people who were coming crying, and the prosecutors also, you know, like that huge men, sometimes women, we're still having the gender inequality, but just sitting, telling me the stories and crying. And you're just understanding how amazing is that in Ukraine still the international crimes are prosecuted during the ongoing armed conflict. And in my personal opinion, we're doing an absolutely great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Andrea, please.
So thank you very much for the opportunity that I can again talk to you about issues which I find important. And what I would like to share with you is a topic which is not that often addressed by this discussion, and that's sexual violence during military occupation. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because I wrote a book about the sexual violence during the Second World War in Hungary, when the Red Army was liberating Hungary. And there were massive rapes which were committed by the Red Army. And of course, some of you might know about the rapes in Germany. But that was a modus operandi of the Red Army, committing rapes. And I wrote a book about this, and which turned to be I've been working on this from 1997. And of course, when you are a young academic, you believe you publish an article and the world will stop moving and you make the change. And it actually did not happen. So I was slightly, unhappy why this is not happening till the liberal turn. Because when my article was available online, I became the most quoted historian by the far right and conservative forces, saying that even the feminist historian Andrea Peto is proving that there were mass rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers. And then it shows that the research is out there and it's instrumentalized. But what I learned during this period, when I was doing this research and I was interviewing women who were raped during in 44 and 45 in Hungary, that how sensitive and how difficult this problem is, and how what kind of sources are available, and what are the limits of collecting testimonies, and what kind of institutions and NGOs are there to support the victims. And I'm mentioning this because my book got this new exposure when in Budapest they decided to set up a memorial for women who are the victims of sexual violence. And when this was announced, next day the Russian state TV was in my office in Budapest at that time, and they made a 1-hour interview with me, hoping to catching me as a Russophobic person. And this was never aired, this interview, so I consider it as a major success that I gave an interview which was not aired. And what I would like to underline, based on this introduction, that the issue of sexual violence during wartime, none of the states are actually doing a good job nowadays with sexual violence during peacetime. So, and there is this continuity of violence, which Cynthia Enloe coined this term. So this kind of violence is not coming from nowhere. And we know that there is research analyzing the homecoming Soviet soldiers after the Second World War, which actually resulted in an increase in divorce, because the soldiers returned and then they were basically dependent on alcohol, and they were violent, and then the wives just decided to divorce. And this, the continuity of violence is very much there, together with the not speaking about this and not talking about the experience of the Second World War. And of course, as a historian, I'm always going back to the point that that the memory of the Second World War and writing about the Second World War is actually one of the problems we have at the moment, that the soldiers who returned from the Second World War, they did not have the space to talk about their experience outside the patriotic, heroic framework, because that was the Cold War. And we also know that the female soldiers who were serving in the Red Army, they did not have the chance to talk about their real experiences, because they had to go back to the serving the so-called statist feminist emancipation, which means that they had to serve in the kitchen, doing the care work while at the same time working. So there was no space to talk about this, and of course the discussion about the Cold War, they already started to instrumentalize the rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers, that this was only the Red Army soldiers whose deeds were discussed, and not the Allied forces, which also committed several rapes. Just think about the recent book about Normandy, that the French troops were committing really serious crimes, and also the American soldiers. So in a sense, the whole issue of sexual violence is more complicated than to be pinned to a certain army during the Second World War. Still, the discussion has been very much connected to that. And then I arrived to the how to explain why certain soldiers rape and why other soldiers don't. And of course, lot has an explanation is the military culture and how an army is basically set up. And the Red Army was an imperial army in the sense that it was very heterogeneous, and it was a very different military discipline. And also that there are two explanations, and one is this kind of intentionalist framework, and the other is the structuralist framework. The intentionalist, which is saying that the Soviet soldiers came to rape the Hungarian women or the German women, and of course this is very rude and not really explaining the complexities of the phenomenon. And the other is the structuralist explanation, which is going back to the second wave of the women's movement, the rape as a weapon of war. And I would argue that none of these explanations are sufficient to explain why certain soldiers are raping and why sexual violence is so prevalent in military conflicts. And having said that, when I was preparing the Russian edition of my book, because the book is translated and published now in Russian, and I hope that it will be read by those who cannot access to other languages. I really invested a lot of energy to the translation of the book to Russian, because this is a kind of possibility for a dialogue and the discussion of how the Red Army and the reputation of the Red Army has been developed. But don't forget that I cannot really put anybody's name in the Russian edition who helped me in this publication, because there is a law which actually sentences to 6 to 12 years of imprisonment to anybody who is questioning the myth of the Red Army. And this, I think, mostly hurts Russia first, and then hurts others as well, but firstly it hurts Russia, I think. And I started with the statement of that the other states are really not doing well as far as sexual violence during peacetime is concerned. But what we have seen in the first months of the war, that the different civil organizations were extremely helpful helping and documenting sexual violence cases in Ukraine, and the different Polish NGOs helping Ukrainian women who got pregnant because of the sexual violence to get out from Poland, because Poland, the abortion is not allowed even if it is the result of rape. So when we are talking about how to document and how to persecute certain war crimes, we have to acknowledge that sexual violence, rape became a war crime because of the activity of the different women's organizations and activists during the Yugoslav war, because this was the result of the enormous war crimes committed during the Yugoslav wars. And now we see that, again, the civil organizations were those who actually jumped in and replaced the non-functioning state. So this was the sign that I have to stop. And I just want to say that this is the moment to express the gratitude to those civilians and those women who actually, under the radar, very often supported and helped women who had to leave Ukraine and they were looking for help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to each of the panelists for staying so well within your time frame. I appreciate that. I have one question before we turn it to the audience that I want to attempt to connect the thread between Alexandra's keynote and where we're at now in the day. As Alexandra said, unless this becomes an intractable conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there's a scenario where Ukraine wins and Russia loses. So I want your thoughts on what accountability looks like when Russia loses. And I'm going to frame this in the context of a conversation I had with a colleague in Ukraine 2 months ago. And the question came up of what does it look like for Russia to lose? And his answer was, it has to be complete. Military destruction, cultural destruction, political destruction, social destruction. Russia has to be rebuilt from the ground up. I have a sense that that could be counterproductive because it leads to this cycle of revenge and retaliation where a generation from now we're back in this conflict. But it raises an important question. What does accountability look like for Russia that is justice, but also is not the type of justice that leads to future violence? Kristina. You were shaking your head most.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, with my panelist who is coming from Ukraine. Would you like to answer first?
I can start. Thank you very much. It's a very important question and very difficult question. So I get that it's worth it to talk about 3 types of accountability. First thing, what we need to understand is about which accountability are we talking about related to which type of court, for example. If we're talking about ICJ, so I will remind this at the United Nations Court, we're talking about the issue of the state responsibility. So this is the case where we can say that Russia violated, like, for example, genocide convention. But for this, there has to be the proper application from Ukraine. If we're talking about individual criminal responsibilities, so basically this is the kind of accountability that we're all used to. Of course, we're talking about the prisons, first of all. I would not reflect here if Putin people in the prison equals to the crimes that they are committing, because here I'm Ukrainian, I will just keep myself from that. Yes, from all this justice system and talking about these punishments, because to be very honest, unfortunately I lost couple of my friends in this conflict, and I cannot say that if the war criminals who committed these war crimes would be put in the jails in very comfortable conditions, it will satisfy me. So this topic I will just put aside. Okay, let's take prisons. But for the current moment, the problem is that the most prosecutions are made in absentia. So in absentia, it means that the perpetrators are located in the other country, so basically in Russia. So to have them, we need to somehow get them out of Russia. There is a very interesting ongoing case. It's about al-Bashir, the president. It was not easy to take him to the International Criminal Court. And now we will be observing how there would be the case against the president ongoing. Of course, we'll hope that the same would be with Putin. But again, between the arrest warrant against al-Bashir and basically having him in Hague, 10 years passed. So talking about accountability, we need to understand that the most of the perpetrators, the majority of perpetrators, they are located not in Ukraine. Of course, here we have to talk about, let's say, historical aspect of accountability, so that we were discussing during the previous panel, what is black and what is white. And here the international criminal system can make a very, very good step with this tribunal for Putin that is like discussed currently, with the International Criminal Court, so to say that these are the crimes, this is not good. Because when you are listening to Russian propaganda, and as far as I'm working with Russian propaganda, my mobile phone, like with all those Russian telegrams channels, it's like all the Russian propagandists. And my mornings are starting from reading how Russian crimes are basically not crimes, that they are doing the great job. So it's very important to have that historical narratives that this state and this government are accountable for the crimes committed. This is black, this is not good. And of course, the main type of accountability and its consequence is reparations. So this financial side, and lots of my colleagues are working on the questions of sanctions. This is also a very difficult question as far as it came around. I'm not personally working like with this question, but for example, talking about the current level of compensations, just to share with you 1 out of 100 problems. If there is the attack against civilian object, if it's a house, for example, a household, a person can have the compensation, but just for the facility. For all the equipment inside of the facility, I don't know, like washing machine, for example, furniture, cars, there is no compensation. If the business is bombed, and lots of businesses in Ukraine were bombed. For example, recently the post office, we're having that, it's called Nova Poshta. Amazing, absolutely amazing business. They are doing absolutely fantastic job. They're working like on all the occupied territories immediately. They're just coming there, opening their offices, risking like their life basically, but they are working. You know, like Post is currently it's super important for Post to be working. They were just bombed a couple of days ago. Business is like struggling to survive now, and if business is bombed, there is no compensation. So everyone is just waiting for the reparations. So it's very, very, very important to work in all these, let's say, directions, not forgetting to put the perpetrators in the prisons and to try to get the reparations as soon as possible. Yeah, thank you very much, Jim.
Please.
So I'd like to answer this to complement what Anna said and to think about 4 groups of actors that I think are really important to the answer of this question. And the first thing that I would say is that it would be a disaster for really, I would say, everybody except Vladimir Putin and his inner circle if Russia wins. And by that I mean it would be a disaster for the Russian population. It would push off coming to terms with things that have been needing to come to terms much, much longer than 2022. And so the first group that I'll talk about that's relevant to genocide prevention is policymakers. So a lot of what I go around doing is saying, yes, accountability, yes, documentation, it's absolutely vital. We also need to have conversations about what a type of genocidal logic, what a destructive logic, what we know from genocide studies, how that shapes policy decision making, how we can expect maybe the sort of Russian mentality in this way to take greater risks, to go to greater inconveniences, to really double down when we would view it against their self-interest. And so policymakers will play a role in that healthy defeat of a military victory for Russia so that Russian society can come to terms. The second is, I already alluded, is academics. And so here I like to kind of, I have a room full of a lot of Americans, so I hope this works. But, you know, Al Capone was one of our notorious gangsters. And when you read academic works or historical books on what Al Capone, the gangster, did, you can get a good, complete view of what actually happened. Now, if you look at his legal record, he's a tax evader. And so the sort of the legal, what was able to be through the legal system and what academics and experts painting the whole portrait of what happened is actually paints a closer to the truth portrait of what was actually going on, you know. So they play a vital role too. And so also we might look at cases like Armenia, where their recognition came so late for so many, but scholars are playing a role there. In many other cases, I first came to Ukraine to look at the Ukrainian Holodomor. I'm looking at archives about how Stalin talked about Ukrainians in the 1930s, how Raphael Lemkin in 1953 viewed the Holodomor, and how he talks about as long as Ukrainians feel themselves independent, like Russia will keep trying to suppress that. And when I read that now, so many decades later, it has something to say. So that good academic work is going to be really important, not just for Ukraine, but helping Russia come to terms with what has been done in their name. Now, on the sort of other side, lawyers. You know, I'm just lawyers and law enforcement. I would say I'm consistently just sort of humbled by the work that you know you're describing and the work that's going on. That's really important. But I also want to mention the fourth category, and that I would say is civil society. So we are so fortunate to have, I would say, both a lawyer and, you know, our keynote speaker is really a civil society leader as well. So sometimes these lines are blurred. But also I would look out in our audience today, and I'm so thankful to know who I'm speaking to. I know I'm speaking to a lot of students. I know I'm speaking to members of the public. And so you also have a role to play here. And so this will be about, you know, the huge impact that civil society has played for support for Ukraine and for support for a future where Russia is able to reckon with its past. So I think those four groups have a role to play in answering your question.
Thank you. Andrea.
Thank you. I mean, historians should not do any predictions because that's pretty dangerous, but there is the historical analogies which can help us to prepare different scenarios. And the historicals, and we also see there is this big debate now that there is a need for Nuremberg, that it should be a only international court, it should be a hybrid court, it should be only a national court, and luckily we have got this very extensive scholarship which shows that not necessarily the legalism is the answer, because we are talking about mass crimes, and maybe the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa might be a good example and to learn from that past. But I'm also very much against these rude historical analogies, because historical analogies are the only tool we have. On the other hand, it gives a very false security that we know what is happening. And basically, at the moment, what we know is that we don't really know anything, and anything can happen. So as a historian, I would rather go I would like to make one argument about what happens till we get there, that that there will be a different Russian system, and I would like to address the problem of the intellectual refugees, both from Russia and also from Ukraine, and also the different systems which are really not working at the moment, because the system which is offering refuge for the different scholars are coming from the Cold War, and on the conception that this will last 1 or 2 years and then they will go back and then they will make the change. But it is really not working this way nowadays. So I would actually urge us to rethink the structure of knowledge production and institutions which are giving a space or including or helping different scholars who had to leave their countries, not only because this brain drain is a tragedy, and but also that there should be a space where lots of smart colleagues are discussing how to move forward. And it's this place is one of the first attempts to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for those contributions. We'd love to turn now to questions from you. If you have a question, we'll have microphones on both sides of the room. Please just identify yourself, briefly state your question, and if it's directed to a certain panelist, let us know that. If it's for the entire panel, you can let us know that as well. So please, Alex.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this wonderful panel and for the whole day in the conference. My name is Julie Gallagher. I'm a historian at Penn State University. And I wanted to ask a question about UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and how can you talk about how UN norms around women, peace, and security or gender-based violence, where do you see them mattering in this? You know, there are these big moments at the UN where there's a recognition of these accomplishments or benchmarks, but then on the ground, do they have any impact whatsoever? So I was wondering if you can each speak to that from your own perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a really important question, how these UN resolutions can be implemented and what kind of impact they have. And what I see, which is interesting from my perspective, is how the practice is actually overwriting the UN security measures, because if you look at the participation of women in the Ukrainian armed forces, or if you look at how many women actually join the different paramilitary organizations from Poland to Estonia to other countries, you see that there is a paradigm shift happening now. And this is related to the issue of women and militarism, women and feminism, and military action, because if you look at the scholarship, this is mostly coming from the northern American context and very much informed by the Vietnam War and the anti-militarism and for the peace action. And what we see now is that this kind of scholarship is very much questioned, and it's discussed by Ukrainian feminists and activists very thoroughly. Just think about this really important Solidarity Act, which was organized right after the war. The full-scale invasion started in March, which was organized by Judith Butler, and she started saying that the purpose should be that Russia would voluntarily put down the arms. And then that was actually a really important moment in the history of feminism, militarism, gender discussion, because that was the moment when it turned out that there are two different words, parallel words. And I personally think that these words should discuss and collaborate. But lots of colleagues from Ukraine were totally appalled by this approach because they considered it as a kind of empty kind of peaceful reaction towards what's happening. And recently, I had a course together with Paula Villa at the LMU about gender and militarism in the light of the war, and it was really fantastic how lots of colleagues from Ukraine and Poland and the so-called eastern flank of the NATO showed up, and they were expressing concerns and issues which hadn't been addressed by other institutions. So this the UN 1325 is something which is really important, a starting point, but I would say that the reality is somewhere much ahead of what is there, and it's the next months, years will show how this kind of cleavage, which is at the moment very obvious in the feminist scholarship, will somehow be find a common ground. Thank you.
Well, I basically do not have much to add, just like probably will share about the female representation. And to be honest, while working in the East, I was just amazed by the... Okay, I will just be very, very frank. When I'm working, like, I work a lot, of course, with men, because I'm working a lot with military and with different international organizations, and normally you see how big, strong men are coming, watching at you like at a girl, okay, what she's doing here, okay, let she be here. And I had lots of field visits, like, together with the male. Of course, I mean, like, I definitely loved these on-site visits. That was great, but you could feel a very, very big level of stress. And then during one of my projects, I had to interview one of the organizations, one mobile brigade. And they had, like, in that mobile brigade, a social worker, psychologist, medical worker, and lawyer and coordinator. So I knew that they had the visit to the very frontline cities like Vovchansk and Kupiansk. So I was expecting that there would be like super stressful mobile brigade coming, and I wanted like to short the interview for like 10 minutes and run away. And then, you know, kind of 5 sons like sun, so sunny girls just came, and I was like absolutely amazed. They were just smiling after the full day of a very, very difficult field mission, talking with people, helping people. And you know, like when you're going on field mission, everyone is expecting that you will save the world. Everyone is like, oh, why you do not build the windows? What are the problems? We are poor here. You are rich. So there are lots of these issues. And I was amazed by this energy that was brought. So I think that there were lots of prejudice, like if female can do this job, if female go like to the field visits. And also one more thing to share. When I was in Vovchansk, I remember I saw girls policemen, absolutely like 18, 19, 20 years old. Also, you know, like very shiny, very happy, very dedicated to their job. And I think that Ukraine is a great example showing that it doesn't matter, absolutely doesn't matter, male or you, female or you. It's more about the person. It's more about how committed you are, in some cases how brave you are, in some cases how much you can adapt to some circumstances. And I think that it's the great case like to share with the world that basically it's not about the gender, it's about people.
Mm. Yeah, my colleagues have been so excellent and specific that maybe I'll just zoom out for a minute. I was recently listening to a talk by a Ukrainian intellectual, and he was discussing the legacy of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and Ukraine. And he said, for modern Ukrainians, he thinks that the legacy is to be Ukrainian is to be acutely aware that you are in charge of your own rescue. And I would like to invite us as an audience to think about our personal responsibility in upholding things that are international norms, like we were just talking about. And so when you have these norms, there's a role where it matters if we say it does. And, you know, when I look at Ukraine, when I look at the importance of Ukraine for issues that I care a lot about, like women, peace, and security, I look at what is happening with the violation of fundamental UN Charter principles. So things like territorial integrity, state sovereignty, like basics, and not just norms like UN Charter. And so the reason that what is happening in Ukraine also matters to me for all of the other cases of atrocities that I work in is really, I think that you could argue that with Russia's sort of blatant attempt to forcibly seize at least like 5 distinct provinces of their country's sovereign territory, it's no longer just violating the principles, it's arguing through action that those principles don't exist. And so that is, to me, why what is happening in Ukraine is so important. If those principles can be undermined, it matters for every case, and it really matters for many different types of people who are vulnerable in their particular local context. So women, with the types of things that we know women are vulnerable to as both refugee populations or during warfare. It matters for every other minority that you can think of. And so I think I'll just mention that's really what's going on here. It can sound a little cerebral, but it's really, that to me is what's really going on here.
Thank you. Sam, was there a question here? Oh, okay. Another question? Here's one in the middle. Perfect. Oh, okay. We'll go here first and then to the middle. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rowan. I'm an undergraduate at Indiana State University, and my question spawned from Dr. Hook's dialogue on the definition of genocide, but please feel free to answer it, as all the panelists. So the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide uses Raphael Lemkin's definition, which had originally included intentional political motives as a conspiracy to commit genocide. However, it was rejected by the Soviet Union and didn't make the modern definition that we know today. Subsequently, we've seen an increase in violence as a result of political motives that have been difficult for the international community to define as genocide. For the ongoing Ukrainian-Russian war, do you believe that an updated definition of genocide would help countries and international organizations in holding the Russians accountable for their atrocities?
Thank you. That's a great question. So 2 things. I have 2 answers. In the immediate sense that I think, based on the evaluation that we've done, the extensive work, that in the case of Ukraine, I'm looking at the targeted group as the national group. I think the UN Genocide Convention is sufficient for us to be quite bullish and quite sort of fierce about the case that we're making. Now, on the other hand, the sort of, this is where when I interact a lot with my lawyer colleagues, they are sort of bound by things like precedent, established jurisprudence, and that's where being a social scientist can be a little bit more fun because we get to also try to push the field forward a little bit, and then perhaps later, if we're lucky, if we write these articles, that we might even have an impact on jurisprudence. So for the immediate answer to your question, I think the UN Genocide Convention is sufficient to describe and to prosecute what Russia is doing in Ukraine. That being said, I think that there's lots of fascinating scholarly work and definitional debates that, again, can sound cerebral and dry, but also matter for the types of targeted groups that you're talking about. And so that's very much a big source of discussion, as Jim also knows, in the academic field of genocide studies.
Thank you. We had another question. Yes, please.
Hello. So I am a teacher fellow at the Human Rights Institute close to home, and it was we just met, and as James know, and my teacher friends here, this summer for 2 weeks to study, and there's some of my high school student friends over there, and we had a great experience learning about human rights values, and we made a human rights curriculum, which we're implementing in our classrooms this year, and then meeting again in the summer and revising and implementing the second year before being published. So I left my first graders to be here. So I was interested in all of your opinions on American educators' responsibility to educate human rights values in our classrooms, specifically Andrea, Peto, because you're an educator, and Anna. I was hoping you could speak to your company, LingvaLexa, because as we know, words have so much power, and educating our students on that their words have power, especially in the day and age of being able to click, 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 and they don't realize how much influence and power that has. So as educators, we are on the front lines of instilling community values in these kids and bringing them up as the next generation. So I was hoping you could give some advice or input for American educators and what you would like to see us influence the younger generation.
Thank you, and fantastic. I'm very envious for the students who can be here. That's really a great opportunity for you. So I have been teaching in the American higher education for 31 years. Some of you haven't born yet. But what I learned is that only those courses work which are which are trying to break out from this neoliberalized transmission belt type of courses. What do I mean by this? That if you have got this, in the past 30 years, what I experienced is this the managerialization of higher education and education as such. So you have got these teaching deliverables, this learning outcome, and that somehow makes you forget that why are you doing this? You are doing this because you have got something important to say, something important to share, and you want the students to actually enjoy it. So when I'm telling to the students that let's enjoy this course, they look at me as if I were offering cannabis in the middle of the night. So although actually higher education is about the intellectual joy of doing intellectual work. So, I mean, the course I'm teaching now is, which I really enjoy a lot, is about creative approaches to remembering. And this is a BA course at CEU, and I try to connect memory studies, history, and creative writing. And in the first class, the students were sitting there, and I told them, you have to get a notebook and a pencil. Blah, 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 blah. And for the next class, all of them came with a notebook and a pencil, and none of them actually opened up the Apple thing what they had. And this is not a kind of Luddite approach to technology, but it's one step back and think about how can you teach when a ChatGPT can, respond to the exam question in 2 seconds? Does it worse to teach a course for a lot of money and for a lot of investment when a ChatGPT can answer to the exam questions like this? So I think that the future of higher education really depends on if we are able to go back to the roots of intellectual work, which is joy, happiness, and self-empowerment of the students to do something which makes the difference. Thank you.
Say something about speech.
Okay, so let me then switch to the education, probably the thing on how to work with the propaganda issues. And basically this is super important. Like, why did I come to making my own organization? After I met an amazing Nobel Prize winner, Maria Ressa, who was basically, probably have heard about her, who was basically working with the issues of propaganda on the social networks, and we had an amazing 2 or 3 hours conversation on how to work with the bot farms influence. And one of the projects I'm working on, and I'm very, very excited to work on it, is to how to ensure accountability for the people who are sitting, let's say, behind the bot farms and who are instigating the war crimes in Ukraine. That is quite interesting. And then when I started to work with the social networks, I understood that the propaganda went on an absolutely another level, with all those TikToks, Vkontakte, Russian social network, Instagrams, and etc., etc. So in the Genocide Convention, when we were talking about incitement to genocide, and one of a serious cut during the discussions was that propaganda of genocide is not criminalized under Genocide Convention, only incitement to genocide. The difference is, what is incitement to genocide? Go and kill. So just telling that the nation, the race is bad, it's not incitement to genocide. And that's why it's also a very difficult crime to work on. So when we started to work and to search the messages on the social networks, and when we started to work on the analysis, and I have an amazingly good team of really young professionals, IT specialists, cyber specialists, that young generation who know what TikTok is. I'm not on TikTok, for example, and I would never be there. And one of, I don't know, 10 interesting things, for example, Telegram channels. They have those emojis, right? Like when something is good, or fire, or smiling. And immediately, when you are reading some message and seeing their likes, you are immediately perceiving it as it's something good. When I was living in Kharkiv, so Belgorod, it's a Russian city where from the missiles were flying. I was subscribed on 2 Telegram channels, on like Kharkiv Telegram channel. So we're known like in Ukraine, all the information from Telegram channel because it's super rapid. So if you're hearing the air alert, you're just going on Telegram and reading, okay, what's going on? Is it dangerous? Should you go to the shelter or not? And I was subscribed on the Belgrade Telegram channel. And there immediately in Belgrade, we are bombing these holes, we are doing great job, or something like that. And in Kharkiv Telegram channels, those are bombing us, we need to go to the bomb shelters. And you're seeing those emojis, and it's absolute, it's insane how immediately you are perceiving the information in different ways. And I understand if I was sitting in Belgrade, I would be thinking that my guys are doing a good job. So, like the thing that I really want to ask all the educators, educate students, school children on how to read what's going on in the internet. This, let's say, media hygiene, what to read, how to read, because when you are scrolling social media, the inbuilt function is that manipulation. So basically what was developed in business purposes now has an absolutely horrible influence on how people are perceiving the information about the armed conflict. So this is the thing I would really, really ask you to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And it's a great question about the importance of social media literacy. So thank you for bringing that up. Another question, please. So, a couple here in front. Alex, or...
Thank you so much for your great presentations, and also especially Andrea, Peto. I'm also a historian and a sociologist, so I really appreciate whatever you shared about remembrance and the importance of remembrance. But my name is Nasim Basiri. I'm an assistant professor in women, gender, and sexuality studies at UConn. And I come from Iran, and from my own experience of studying gender violence during the wars and genocides and all, I can tell you that there is no accountability for any of those criminals, whether they are, we are talking about accountability for the victims of mass atrocities, for instance, the 1988 mass atrocities in Iran that we are still fighting for, we are still asking for justice, and instead of, getting support, we are actually being criminalized. So that is the scenario that I think nobody wants to talk about, what happens after the war, what happens after the genocide. Mm-hmm. The case of Armenian genocide tells us that after 100 years, they could finally get the genocides recognized by the United States. Or what happens, for instance, to the activists, to the researchers who want to investigate the war crimes or the genocides or the political violence visited on, for instance, the dissent in countries ruled by fascist regimes or by like religious fundamentalists, like in the case of Iran. So there's no accountability. And 44 years, for instance, when we talk about the case of Iran, nothing really happened to the religious fundamentalists. They are still in power. They are still traveling the world. They are still having their agents all over the West and in the international organizations. And nobody talks about it. So I think shifting our focus from accountability to peacemaking in these critical times would be a better option to address issues around violence. And then I don't see any hope in accountability for example, a government like Vladimir Putin's that is kind of a superpower, or the Chinese government or the Iranian government, or what's really happened to, in terms of justice for the Yazidi women, or for the cases of sexual slavery, or all these female political prisoners of conscience being raped in Iranian prisons. When you talk about it, they go after you, even in the United States, even in Canada. So I think it's very naive to kind of talk about accountability, because at the end they have the power, and at the end their projects starts, the projects of persecution starts right after the war. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll finish here. I'll ask each panelist to give a very brief response to this, because you raise an important issue. You can either talk about what you see as the most significant hurdle to accountability, or what you see as the reason for it. Why is it necessary? Why do you think we need it?
Yeah, I understand, I think, where you're coming from. And so I think that, gatherings like this are really important, because when you are going up against atrocity perpetrators, you're going up against people who work pretty hard to do the evil things they're doing. They're often quite savvy at doing the evil things they're doing. And so thinking really critically, thinking really strategically, making sure we get the crimes right. There's nothing more heartbreaking than if a prosecutor kind of misdiagnoses a criminal category and then can't get someone justice in a courtroom. But I think that all of these things matter. Having a lot of both public discussions around it and a lot of private discussions around it are really important to crafting these strategies, and that's what I've seen very much ongoing. And so I think I'd like to end with just a kind of personal reflection on why it matters. And I hadn't planned on saying this. I think it says something about the organization of this summit so far, where we've all kind of shared personal things. I went to Ukraine to look at what I thought would be a historical case of genocide. So my background is in Holocaust and genocide studies. So I've actually, some of my first trips in Ukraine were to Baba Yar. And then I also wanted to look at the Holodomor, because I didn't know that much about it. And so I thought, historical genocide would be looking at that. And I ended up writing my PhD dissertation, and I called it after a quote that somebody told me about the Holodomor. And they said, "What was it?" "Oh, it was in the 1930s. And I said, "Oh, this many generations later, oh, that was when the Ukrainian world was destroyed." And this idea of world destruction now really kind of shapes for me in a deep way about how I approach the Holocaust, Holodomor, like genocides in kind of broader sense, like that collapse of so many different worlds. And one of the things that has been devastating to watch this kind of resurgence of violence with specific patterns in Ukraine that I thought would be consigned to the history books is that I've actually seen now people in modern Ukraine talking about using similar metaphors, talking about, when their world collapsed. Actually, Alexander Matvichuk mentioned a quote from a courtroom that's happening now. And so I had somebody talking about a past instance in Ukrainian history, and we heard from somebody else at present. And if we don't somehow, in a strategic, savvy, non-naive way, disrupt these cycles of violence, we will just probably see something again. And so if I can, it would be a privilege for me to just kind of end with a quote from our report, because it's a quote from a Ukrainian woman. She is from Saltivka, which is a suburb of Kharkiv, and she left her suburb when her husband was killed when he was getting fuel. And I think about these words a lot, and so it would be nice for me if my last words could be hers here. And she said, life used to be beautiful here. To be honest, I can't look at this without tears. I have no words. They destroyed everything. They left us without our loved ones, without our parents, without husbands, without sons, without our previous life, without jobs, without anything. And so right now I'm working on Ukraine, but I care a lot about these other issues that I know many in the room do too. And we have to disrupt this pattern of world destruction. And so thank you so much for having me today.
Thank
thank you so much for raising this question. I mean, like in such an honest and open manner, because, you know, it's kind of an elephant in the room. We're all talking about the accountability and then coming to the statistic, okay, how many people are accountable? I fully agree with you. I will just mention one thing. I would rather not put but between accountability and peace building, because it's just one part of peace building. So basically, at this point, we're talking about the so-called transitional justice that has 4 pillars. So the first pillar is justice itself. So there is that victim-centered approach. So there is right to justice. So, and basically the ensuring of accountability, this part of right to justice. We also have the right to truth. And this is something different sometimes. It has to be the same, but it's a broader agenda. It's probably you have heard about this Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. But it's the truth, it's also the policy of memorialization, of course. The third part is the DDR, so it's basically demobilization and reintegration of former combatants, and that would be also a very, very big agenda in Ukraine, as it's in every conflict. And it's the right for reparations. So all the things are interconnected, but only when we are working like on these 4 pillars, not just ensuring accountability basically, but all these 4 pillars. In this case, peace building and transitional justice somehow starts to work, somehow. Thank you so much for this question.
Thank you for the question, but I would say that we know that this system is not perfect, but if we are not using the system if its full potential, we are left and we are without important means. And this is especially tragic because we see that the different illiberal states are developing a parallel legal system. And in the previous panel, I brought in this polyporization term, which is, emptying, instrumentalizing an already existing important concept, term, or institution. And we also see the polyporization of the legal system and the legal concepts. So it is not an accident that it was Russia which first questioned the concept of domestic violence, and they introduced a different legal language. It is not an accident that it was the Hungarian government which introduced an alternative to the CEDAW Commission. The CEDAW Commission is the UN Convention for the Women's Rights, and 36 governments actually subscribed for this alternative convention on women's rights. So on the one hand, this is an academic debate that we are very, critical, and that's our job to be critical. On the other hand, what we see is really a practical fight for those instruments and determining what is the content of that legal instrument. And I would say that, of course, we have to be critical because that's what we are getting paid for, but if we let these instruments go, then we are there without any instruments in an extremely difficult and deadly fight. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your thoughtful questions and engagement. Thank my panelists for their brilliant remarks throughout as well. Because I am a poor moderator, we're 5 minutes behind schedule. So the next session is going to start at 3:20. We're moving our attention a bit beyond Ukraine to talk about challenges to global democracy writ large. So please, 15-minute break. We'll see you again at 3:20. Thank you.
Thank you so much.